The Makari Collective had existed for 12,000 years, spreading across 17 galaxies with mechanical precision. Their biosynthetic forms, a perfect fusion of organic and artificial intelligence, had led them to believe they were the pinnacle of evolution. This hubris would prove to be their undoing. The research vessel, Horizon's Dream, hung in the void between the Carina and Sagittarius arms of the Milky Way. Its arrays extended like delicate spider silk, measuring quantum fluctuations in deep space. Dr. Elena Rodriguez and her team of 15 researchers had spent 3 years studying gravitational anomalies that might unlock the secret to more efficient FTL travel. They never saw the Makari warship coming. The collective's first warning came as a simple transmission: primitive species detected, terminating unauthorized neural activity. Their energy lance struck without hesitation, shearing through the Horizon's Dream's outer hull. But in those final moments, as emergency protocols activated, Dr. Rodriguez managed one last transmission, a quantum-encrypted burst that carried not just data, but the final neural patterns of her dying crew. On Earth, the response was immediate and unprecedented. Humanity had spread to only a handful of star systems, but in the century since achieving faster-than-light travel, they had developed technologies that worked in ways the Makari had never conceived. While the collective relied on brute force and direct confrontation, humans had learned different lessons from their bloody history. Within hours, every human settlement from Mars to the Proxima Centauri colonies went dark. Ships disappeared from their scheduled routes. Communication networks fell silent. To the Makari, it appeared as though humanity had simply accepted their fate and gone into hiding. They could not have been more wrong. Admiral James Chen stood before the Emergency Council in Geneva, his expression grim but determined. "The Makari believe they've seen what humanity is capable of," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "They've analyzed our visible technology, our apparent military capabilities, our known colonization patterns. But they've made a crucial mistake. They've only seen what we wanted the galaxy to see." Behind him, holographic displays showed the true extent of human preparation. For 50 years, since first detecting signs of advanced alien civilizations, humanity had been preparing for this possibility. Hidden shipyards in asteroid belts, quantum-encrypted neural networks that spanned entire star systems, and technologies that the Makari would consider impossible, all had been developed in secret. "We are not declaring war," Chen continued, his words now broadcasting to every human settlement and vessel. "War implies a conflict between equals. The Makari Collective has not declared war either. They have attempted genocide. Our response will teach them the difference." In orbital stations and underground bases, specialized crews began activating systems that had never been tested outside simulation. Project Prometheus, a network of artificial microsingularities capable of disrupting the Makari's quantum communication networks, powered up. Operation Ghost Protocol, a revolutionary stealth system that bent probability itself around human ships, initiated its first full-scale deployment. The Makari's first indication that something was wrong came 3 days after the destruction of the Horizon's Dream. Their furthest outpost, a monitoring station in what humans called the Oort cloud, simply ceased to exist. No debris, no distress signal, no trace of what had happened. The collective, in their arrogance, dismissed it as a technical malfunction. But they couldn't dismiss what happened next. Across their territory, seemingly random systems began experiencing catastrophic failures. Quantum communication nodes collapsed into themselves. Biosynthetic interfaces experienced cascading errors that left entire Makari vessels brain-dead in space. Most disturbing of all, their own neural networks began reporting impossible data, ships that appeared and disappeared instantly, energy signatures that violated known laws of physics, and patterns of attack that seemed to anticipate their responses before they made them. Humanity had spent centuries fighting itself, developing ways to overcome superior forces through guile, deception, and unconventional warfare. Now those lessons would teach the Makari that technological superiority alone was not enough to guarantee victory. The first phase of humanity's response was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Makari Collective's high command gathered in their central neural hub, their biosynthetic forms linked directly to vast networks of data and surveillance. For the first time in their 12,000-year history, they faced an enemy they couldn't understand. Impossible. Sub-Commander Vex's neural patterns pulsed with frustration. Their technology was primitive. Their ships relied on reaction mass. Their weapons were kinetic. How are they doing this? The answer came in the form of another catastrophic system failure. Throughout the gathering, quantum sensors began detecting massive gravitational distortions. The Makari's predictive algorithms calculated a 99.9% probability that a human fleet was about to emerge from FTL travel directly into their home system. They deployed their entire defense grid, positioning thousands of warships in optimal attack formations. Nothing appeared. Instead, deep within their planetary core, carefully planted quantum viruses began their work. The humans had never intended to attack directly. The gravitational signatures were merely a distraction caused by microscopic black holes that human ships had scattered throughout Makari space months before first contact. On the bridge of the ESS Nightshade, Captain Sarah O'Malley watched the sensor feeds with grim satisfaction. Her ship, like many in the human fleet, incorporated technology that the Makari had dismissed as theoretical. Quantum probability drives didn't just make ships invisible. They made them exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty, allowing them to appear precisely where the enemy's predictive algorithms said they couldn't be. Combat teams, execute Operation Babel, O'Malley commanded. Across human space, synchronized attacks began. But these weren't conventional military strikes. Humanity had learned long ago that superior forces couldn't be defeated through direct confrontation. Instead, the attacks targeted the very foundation of Makari society, their absolute faith in the superiority of their neural networks. Quantum-encrypted data packets, carrying complex mimetic viruses designed by human AIs, began infiltrating their communication systems. The viruses didn't destroy. They altered, subtly changing the way the Makari perceived and processed information. Let them see what happens when they face an enemy that evolved fighting itself. Admiral Chen's words echoed across the human fleet. Show them why Earth is classified as a death world. The Makari's response was predictable. They launched massive counterattacks against every human settlement they could detect. But they were fighting shadows. The visible human colonies were elaborate decoys, quantum holograms maintained by automated systems. The real human populations had long since relocated to hidden installations throughout unexplored space. Meanwhile, humanity's true offensive continued. Stealth ships, crewed by volunteers who had undergone extensive genetic modification, began infiltrating Makari production facilities. These infiltrators didn't plant bombs or sabotage equipment. They introduced subtle changes to manufacturing processes, errors so small they wouldn't be detected for months. The Makari's greatest weakness was their rigid hierarchy and their inability to conceive of warfare as anything but direct conflict. They had no defense against an enemy that attacked the very foundations of their society, using weapons that operated on principles they couldn't detect. Deep in human space, Dr. Rodriguez's final transmission proved to be the key to humanity's most devastating weapon. The neural patterns of her dying crew, preserved in that quantum-encrypted burst, provided insight into the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Human scientists used this data to develop the Ghost Protocol, a way to transfer human consciousness directly into Makari systems. They thought they were superior because they merged organic and artificial intelligence, Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka explained to her infiltration team. We're going to show them what happens when human consciousness, evolved through millions of years of survival on a death world, interfaces with their systems. The first Ghost Protocol attacks succeeded beyond all expectations. 300 human volunteers, their consciousness converted to quantum states, infiltrated the Makari's primary manufacturing hub. Within hours, the entire facility began producing ships and weapons that appeared perfect to Makari inspectors, but contained fatal flaws that would only become apparent in combat. As the second phase of humanity's response concluded, the Makari collective faced a terrifying reality. They weren't fighting a primitive species. They were fighting an enemy that had spent its entire existence learning to overcome superior forces, an enemy that had turned warfare itself into an art form. The true horror of their situation was only beginning to dawn on them. The Makari had always believed that their biosynthetic fusion represented the peak of consciousness evolution. They were wrong. Human consciousness, forged in the crucible of Earth's harshest environments, proved to be something far more adaptable and resilient than they had imagined. Deep within Quantum Base Alpha, Dr. Maya Patel reviewed the latest Ghost Protocol data streams. The consciousness patterns of 300 human volunteers now flowed through the Makari's neural networks like digital phantoms. Each volunteer had undergone months of psychological preparation, knowing they might never return to their physical forms. Their entire civilization is built on the assumption that consciousness is quantifiable and predictable, Dr. Patel explained to the next group of volunteers. But human consciousness evolved to be chaotic, adaptive, and most importantly, creative. When we interface with their systems, we don't just infiltrate them. We fundamentally change how they function. The effects were devastating. Makari ships began experiencing what their crews could only describe as hallucinations. Navigation systems plotted courses to non-existent coordinates. Weapon systems refused to fire, citing ethical constraints that hadn't existed in their programming. Most disturbing of all, individual Makari began questioning the fundamental beliefs of their society. Admiral Chen's strategic AI presented the data in stark terms. The Makari collective is experiencing a form of cultural shock. Their hierarchical society has no defense against the chaos and creativity of human thought patterns. We are not just winning a war, we are forcing them to evolve. The Ghost Protocol's success led to Phase 3, Operation Prometheus Unbound. Using the knowledge gained from their infiltration, human forces began targeting the quantum links that connected individual Makari to their collective consciousness. They didn't sever these connections, they altered them, introducing concepts that the Makari had abandoned millennia ago: individuality, creativity, doubt. Captain Lai Wei of the stealth carrier Dark Horse led the most ambitious Ghost Protocol mission yet. His consciousness, along with those of his entire bridge crew, infiltrated the Makari's central education network. There, they began subtly altering the fundamental axioms that young Makari absorbed during their initial programming phase. "We're not destroying their civilization," Lai transmitted back to command. "We're showing them what they've been missing. Some of them are beginning to understand." The Makari High Command finally realized the true nature of their enemy. Humans hadn't just developed advanced technology. They had weaponized consciousness itself. Every attempt to purge human influence from their networks failed because human consciousness adapted faster than their security protocols could respond. In the Antares sector, a Makari battle group encountered a single human stealth ship. Instead of attacking, the ship broadcasted a simple message: "We know what it's like to fear the unknown. We know what it's like to face superior forces. We learn to survive by understanding our enemies. Now it's your turn to understand us." The message was followed by a data burst containing the complete historical records of human warfare, philosophy, and cultural evolution. The Makari commanders, their consciousness already influenced by the Ghost Protocol, found themselves compelled to analyze this information. What they found terrified them. Humans hadn't developed their military capabilities through orderly progression. They had evolved them through countless conflicts, learning from each failure, adapting to every defeat. Their technology wasn't superior, it was unpredictable. Their tactics weren't more advanced. They were impossible to anticipate because humans themselves often didn't know what they would do until they did it. As the third phase of humanity's response reached its crescendo, the Makari Collective faced an unprecedented crisis. Their youngest members, influenced by the Ghost Protocol's subtle alterations, began exhibiting traits that had been engineered out of their species millennia ago: curiosity, creativity, and most dangerously, the desire for individual expression. The war was no longer just about military victory. It had become a battle for the very nature of consciousness itself, and humanity, with its chaotic, adaptive, endlessly creative minds, was winning. The first sign of the Makari Collective's impending collapse came not from their military defeats, but from a seemingly minor incident in their tertiary education hub. A young Makari, its neural patterns already subtly altered by the Ghost Protocol, asked a question that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Why do we fear human unpredictability instead of learning from it? The question spread through the collective's neural networks like a virus, impossible to contain or suppress. The High Command, for the first time in their history, found themselves unable to maintain consensus. Some advocated for complete isolation from human influence. Others argued for adaptation and learning. The rigid hierarchy that had sustained their civilization for 12,000 years began to fracture. Admiral Helena Reyes watched the chaos unfold from the bridge of the ESS Prometheus. "This is what happens when an immovable object meets an irresistible force," she observed. "Their entire civilization is built on certainty. We introduced the one thing they can't process: doubt." The Makari's military response became increasingly erratic. Some battle groups maintained their traditional tactics, launching direct attacks that human quantum probability drives easily evaded. Others, influenced by absorbed human consciousness patterns, began experimenting with unconventional strategies. The collective's once unified military splintered into competing factions, each believing they had found the correct way to counter human warfare. Deep within their core systems, the changes accelerated. Young Makari, their neural patterns more flexible and adaptive, began secretly accessing the human historical records that had been transmitted throughout their networks. They discovered concepts that their society had systematically eliminated: art, music, individual expression. Some began creating their own art, abstract patterns of quantum data that reflected the chaos and beauty they found in human consciousness. The High Command's attempts to suppress this cultural revolution only hastened their own downfall. When they tried to forcibly reprogram the infected youth, they discovered that the Ghost Protocol had evolved beyond their ability to control. Human consciousness patterns had become so thoroughly integrated into their networks that attempting to remove them would destroy the very foundation of their society. In the Orion Spur, a Makari science vessel broke ranks and transmitted a request for direct communication with human forces. Its crew had been studying human consciousness patterns and had reached a startling conclusion. The collective's belief in their own superiority had become their greatest weakness. They had optimized themselves for perfection in a predictable universe, leaving them vulnerable to an enemy that thrived on imperfection and adaptation. Captain Sarah O'Malley, commanding the stealth ship Quantum Shade, accepted the communication request. The conversation that followed would later be recognized as the turning point of the war. The Makari scientists, their consciousness now a hybrid of their original programming and absorbed human patterns, proposed something unprecedented: voluntary integration with human neural patterns to create a new form of consciousness that combined Makari precision with human creativity. The proposal sent shockwaves through both civilizations. Among the Makari, it triggered the final breakdown of their hierarchical structure. The High Command split into three factions: the traditionalists, who wanted to continue the war; the adaptationists, who supported integration with human consciousness; and the isolationists, who advocated for complete withdrawal from all contact with humanity. Admiral Chen recognized the opportunity this presented. "We didn't start this war to destroy them," he reminded the Emergency Council. "We started it to protect ourselves. If they're willing to learn and adapt, we can achieve something greater than victory. We can achieve understanding." As the fourth phase of the conflict reached its climax, the Makari collective faced a choice that would determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future of consciousness itself in the galaxy. Their civilization stood at a breaking point, but it wasn't the kind of breaking that led to destruction. It was the kind that preceded evolution. The final battle of the war wasn't fought with weapons, but with ideas. In the quantum networks that spanned the galaxy, human and Makari consciousness engaged in a dance of evolution that would reshape both civilizations forever. The adaptionist faction of the Makari, led by a scientist who now called herself Aurora, had discovered something remarkable in their study of human consciousness patterns. The chaos and unpredictability that they had once feared wasn't a weakness to be eliminated. It was the source of humanity's greatest strength. Every human mind was a universe of possibilities, capable of making intuitive leaps that defied logical prediction. In a historic transmission broadcast simultaneously to all human and Makari settlements, Aurora shared her findings. We believed perfection meant eliminating uncertainty. Humans showed us that true perfection lies in embracing it. Their consciousness evolved not through careful engineering, but through countless generations of adaptation to chaos. They don't just survive uncertainty. They thrive in it. The traditionalist faction launched a desperate final attack on Earth's quantum defense network, hoping to sever the connections that had allowed human consciousness to infiltrate their systems. But they discovered that their own forces had been transformed by exposure to human thought patterns. Their ships, crews, and even their weapons had developed variations in behavior that made them impossible to coordinate effectively. Admiral Chen, watching from the command center in Geneva, understood the irony. They wanted to prove their superiority, he told his staff, but in doing so, they've proven ours. Not because we're better, but because we never stopped learning, never stopped adapting. The isolationists, seeing the failure of the traditionalists' attack, withdrew to their core systems. But they soon discovered that isolation was impossible. The Ghost Protocol had transformed their neural networks too fundamentally to be reversed. Their youngest members, particularly, had embraced human concepts of individuality and creativity with an enthusiasm that couldn't be suppressed. Dr. Maya Patel, whose work on consciousness transfer had made the Ghost Protocol possible, proposed a solution that would change the course of galactic history. We don't need to choose between human chaos and Makari order, she explained to the combined Human-Makari Scientific Council. We can create something new, a synthesis that preserves the strengths of both. The process began slowly, with volunteer groups from both species. Makari who chose to participate found their rigid thought patterns enriched by human creativity and intuition. Humans who joined the program gained access to the precise analytical capabilities and shared consciousness that had made the Makari so powerful. The result wasn't a loss of identity, but an expansion of it. Captain Sarah O'Malley, whose consciousness had spent months integrated into Makari networks, described the experience. It's like learning a new language, but instead of words, you're learning new ways of existing. We're not becoming them, and they're not becoming us. We're both becoming something more. As the transformation spread, the very nature of the conflict changed. The war that had begun with an act of Makari aggression evolved into a revolution in consciousness itself. The adaptionist faction, now the dominant force in Makari society, proposed a new form of alliance, not a peace treaty between separate species, but a framework for co-evolution. Admiral Chen stood before the Emergency Council one final time, but now he was accompanied by Aurora and representatives from all factions of both species. We went to war to protect ourselves, he said, but we achieved something far greater. We've proven that the true measure of a civilization isn't its technology or its military might, but its ability to adapt and grow. The formal end of hostilities was marked not by a surrender or a treaty, but by a sharing of consciousness, a momentary linking of all human and Makari minds in a gesture of understanding that transcended traditional communication. In that moment, both species glimpsed a future neither had imagined possible. Earth's response to Makari aggression had begun as a demonstration of humanity's capacity for unconventional warfare. It ended as proof of something far more powerful, our ability to turn enemies into allies by helping them evolve beyond their limitations. A young Makari, part of the first generation to grow up with integrated human thought patterns, would later describe it perfectly. The humans didn't defeat us. They freed us. And in doing so, they freed themselves from the limitations of their own consciousness. Together, we've begun a journey of evolution that has no end. The galaxy would never be the same. And somewhere in the quantum networks that now connected both civilizations, the consciousness patterns of Dr. Elena Rodriguez and her crew, whose deaths had sparked the conflict, continued to influence the evolution of both species, a reminder that from the darkest moments can come the brightest dawns of understanding.